Dear students, welcome to our channel, The Dental Educators. Today, we will go through the comparative analysis of the maxillary and mandibular premolars. In each quadrant there are 2 premolars. As we have 4 quadrants, so in total we have 8 premolars in a healthy oral cavity. Let's start to compare the different aspects of all premolars in maxillary and mandibular arch and identify the similarities and differences between them. Starting with the general outline observed on the buccal aspect of the premolars. All the first, second, maxillary and first, second mandibular premolars tend to have a trapezoidal outline. Cervical line is evident at the junction of the crown and root. The cervical line for the maxillary and mandibular premolars tends to have curvature towards the apex of the root as marked by the arrows in the images below. On viewing the messile cuspal slopes for the premolars, it is observed that the maxillary first premolars tends have longer messile cuspal slopes, but it is shorter for the maxillary second premolars. This characteristic feature is opposite for the mandibular premolars. In mandibular arch, first premolar tends to have smaller messile cuspal slope, but it is slightly longer for the mandibular second premolars. On other hand, while viewing the distal cuspal slopes for the premolars, it is observed that the maxillary first premolars tends have smaller distal cuspal slopes, but it is longer for the maxillary second premolars. This characteristic feature is opposite for the mandibular premolars. In mandibular arch, first premolar tends to have longer distal cuspal slope, but it is smaller for the mandibular second premolars. Buccal ridge is a linear elevation which is evident on the buccal surface of premolars, extending occluso-cervically, or it could be said as cervico-occlusally, on the maxillary and mandibular premolars as marked in the images. The buccal ridge shows presence of well-developed middle lobe on the maxillary and mandibular premolars. The buccal aspect of all 4 premolar comprises of 3 lobes. One on the mesial side marked by M is referred as mesial lobe, one on distal side marked by D is distal lobe, whereas the lobe in the center is known as middle lobe or buccal lobe, as could be observed on the maxillary first premolar. Similarly, mesial, distal and middle lobes can be observed for the maxillary second premolar, mandibular first premolar and mandibular second premolar. All of the 3 lobes, mesial, middle and distal lobes on the buccal aspect, are separated by some linear developmental depressions which are marked by yellow color. There are 2 developmental depressions observed on buccal aspect of maxillary and mandibular premolars separating the 3 lobes. On viewing from the lingual aspect, it is observed that the buccal cusps are longer than the lingual cusps for both maxillary and mandibular premolars. In today's lecture we are discussing the 3-cusp mandibular second premolar, which tends to have 2 lingual and 1 buccal cusp. It can be observed that the cusp on mesial side mesio-lingual cusp and the cusp on distal side disto-lingual cusp, they are also smaller than the buccal cusp of the mandibular second premolar. as we had a linear elevation in the middle of the buccal aspect known as buccal ridge. Similarly, a linear elevation is evident on middle of the lingual aspect for the maxillary first premolars known as lingual ridge as marked in the image below. This lingual ridge is not evident in the maxillary second premolar and mandibular first and second premolars. There is no groove evident on the lingual aspect separating the lingual cusps for the maxillary first and second premolar and mandibular first premolar. But a lingual developmental groove is observed on the three-cusped mandibular second premolar which separated the Mesio-Lingual cusp from the distal lingual cusp as displayed in the image below. On viewing from lingual aspect, the characteristic features on occlusal surface such as transverse ridges, triangular ridges, central developmental grooves are not evident for the maxillary first and second premolars. But many of the occlusal characteristic features can be observed for the mandibular first premolars as the height of the lingual cusps is significantly shorter than the buccal cusps. Similarly, occlusal characteristic features are evident for the mandibular second premolar as well. On observing the cervical line curvature from lingual aspect, similar curvature to that on buccal aspect is observed for all the maxillary and mandibular premolars from lingual aspect. It can be observed in the image below. The curvature of cervical line for the maxillary first premolar is towards the root apex. Similarly, the cervical line curvature for maxillary second, mandibular first and mandibular second premolars is towards the root apex. In both maxillary first and second premolars they tend to have one lingual cusp. Single cusp on lingual aspect is also observed for the mandibular first premolars. But the three-cusped mandibular second premolar has a special characteristic feature of having two lingual cusps. MLC referring to Mesio-Lingual cusp and DLC referring to Distal lingual cusp. On viewing the number of roots for maxillary first premolars, only one lingual root marked by LR can be viewed from lingual aspect. Buccal root is not visible from lingual aspect for the maxillary first premolars. As the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolar and mandibular second premolar have only one root, therefore same single root can be observed from both lingual and buccal aspects. Further, on observing the crowns from the mesial aspect, the general outline of the crown for maxillary first premolars is trapezoidal. Similarly, the crown shape for the maxillary second premolars from mesial aspect is trapezoidal. But on observing the mesial aspect for the mandibular first premolar and mandibular second premolar, the general outline of the crown is rhomboidal in shape as can be observed in the images below. Messile. On observing the cuspal lengths, it is observed the buccal cusp is longer in height as compared to the lingual cusp for the maxillary first premolars. In the maxillary second premolars as well, the buccal cusp is longer than the lingual cusp but to a smaller extent. Therefore, little difference can be seen between the height of the buccal and lingual cusps for the maxillary second premolars. In the case of mandibular first premolars as well, the buccal cusp is larger than the lingual cusp. But in the case of mandibular second premolars, as we are studying three-cusped mandibular second premolar which has two lingual cusps, therefore the lingual cusp which is towards the mesial side will be considered as the mesio-lingual cusp. For three-cusped mandibular second premolars as well, the buccal cusp is larger than the mesio-lingual cusp as can be observed in the image below. From mesial aspect, the characteristic features on the occlusal aspect are not visible for the maxillary first premolars and maxillary second premolars. But the features on the occlusal aspect like marginal ridges and transverse ridges can be observed for the mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars from the mesial aspect. Mesial developmental depression is an important characteristic feature only observed for the maxillary first premolars. The mesial developmental depression is evident in the cervical third region of the crown extending to the cervical third region of the root as marked in the images below. This characteristic feature of mesial developmental depression is not observed for the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars. Another important characteristic feature observed on the mesial aspect for the maxillary first premolars is the presence of mesial marginal ridge groove. The mesial marginal ridge groove is not evident on the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars. Mesio-Lingual developmental groove is an important characteristic feature not evident in the maxillary first premolars and the maxillary second premolars. This Mesio-Lingual developmental groove, an important characteristic feature, is only evident in the mandibular first premolars. The Mesio-Lingual developmental groove is not evident in the mandibular second premolars as well. Finally, on observing the cervical line curvature from mesial aspect, the cervical line curvature is towards the occlusal surface of the crown for both maxillary first premolars and mandibular second premolars. Similarly, the cervical line curvature for the mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars is observed towards the occlusal surface as marked by the arrows in the images below. Let us observe the characteristic features on the distal surface of all four premolars. The general outline of crown for the maxillary premolars and mandibular premolars from distal aspect is same as we saw on the mesial aspect. The crown outline for the maxillary first premolars is trapezoidal. Similarly, the crown shape for the maxillary second premolars from distal aspect is trapezoidal. But for the mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars, the general outline of the crown from the distal aspect is rhomboidal in shape, which is similar to the outline observed on the mesial aspect of the mandibular premolars. Similar to mesial aspect, on observing the cuspal links on distal aspect, it is observed the buccal cusp is longer in height as compared to the lingual cusp for the maxillary first premolars. In the maxillary second premolars as well, the buccal cusp is longer than the lingual cusp but to a smaller extent as was observed on mesial aspect. Therefore, little difference can be seen between the height of the buccal and lingual cusps for the maxillary second premolars. In the case of mandibular first premolars as well, the buccal cusp is larger than the lingual cusp. But in the case of mandibular second premolars, as we are studying three-cusped mandibular second premolar which has two lingual cusps, therefore the lingual cusp which is towards the distal side will be considered as the disto-lingual cusp. For three-cusped mandibular second premolars as well, the buccal cusp is larger than the disto-lingual cusp as can be observed in the image below. The characteristic features on the occlusal surface for the maxillary first premolars and maxillary second premolars are not evident from the distal aspect. But due to shorter distal marginal ridges for the mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars, the characteristic features such as triangular ridges and transverse ridges on the occlusal surface can be observed from distal aspect for the mandibular premolars as marked in the images below. On observing the cervical line curvature on distal aspect, the cervical line curvature is towards the occlusal surface of the crown similar to mesial aspect as marked by the arrows in the images below for both maxillary premolars and mandibular premolars. But the curvature of cervical line is reduced on the distal aspect in comparison to mesial aspect for both maxillary first premolars and mandibular second premolars. The number of roots visible from the distal aspect on the maxillary first premolars are 2 in number. BR represents buccal root and LR represents lingual root. The maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars are single-rooted. Therefore only one root can be observed for the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars from all the aspects. Now at the end we will observe the characteristic features observed on the occlusal aspect of the maxillary premolars and mandibular premolars. The general outline for the crown of maxillary first premolars is approximately hexagonal in shape. Similarly, a hexagonal outline of the crown is observed for the maxillary second premolars and mandibular first premolars. But the three-cusped mandibular second premolar has a special kind of outline which is more likely to be square in shape as can be observed in the image below. Now let us compare the mesio-distal dimension of buccal cusp with mesio-distal dimension of lingual cusp for all 4 premolars. For the maxillary first premolar it is observed that the mesio-distal dimension of buccal cusp is greater than that of the mesio-distal dimension of lingual cusp. Thus, it has a tendency of tapering lingually as can be observed in the image below. Similarly, the mesio-distal dimension is greater for buccal cusp than that for the lingual cusp of the maxillary second premolars and the mandibular first premolars. Additionally, similar to maxillary first premolars, both maxillary second premolars and mandibular first premolars have a tendency to taper lingually due to smaller mesio-distal dimension of lingual cusp than the buccal cusp. For the three-cusped mandibular second premolar has mesio-distal dimension of buccal cusp equal to the mesio-distal dimension for the 2 lingual cusps as can be observed in the image below. Occlusally, on comparing the bucco-lingual dimension with mesio-distal dimension for the maxillary mandibular premolars, it is observed that the bucco-lingual dimension for the maxillary first premolar is greater than the mesio-distal dimension as can be observed in the image below. Similarly, it is observed the bucco-lingual dimension for the maxillary second premolars is also greater than the mesio-distal dimension. This characteristic feature is different for the mandibular premolars. In the case of mandibular first premolar it can be observed that the bucco-lingual and the mesio-distal dimensions are equal in length. Similar to mandibular first premolars, three-cusped mandibular second premolars also have a tendency of equal bucco-lingual and mesio-distal dimension as can be observed in the image below. The central developmental groove is a linear depression extending mesio-distally from the mesial marginal ridge to distal marginal ridge separating the primary buccal half of the tooth from the lingual half. The central developmental groove extending from mesial marginal ridge towards distal marginal ridge can be observed on the maxillary first premolars in the image below. Similarly, the central developmental groove can also be observed on the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and the mandibular second premolars. Mesial developmental groove is an extension of central developmental groove crossing the mesial marginal ridge. This is an important characteristic feature only evident on the maxillary first premolars over the mesial marginal ridge. There is no mesial developmental groove observed for the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and the mandibular second premolars as can be observed in the images below. Though rarely in some cases there are few developmental grooves crossing the marginal ridges are observed for the maxillary second premolars, mandibular first premolars and mandibular second premolars, but they are not regarded as the mesial developmental groove. This groove is only evident on the maxillary first premolars. The Mesio-Lingual developmental groove is an extension of the central developmental groove between the lingual cusp and the mesial marginal ridge. This important distinguishing characteristic feature of Mesio-Lingual developmental groove is only observed on the mandibular first premolars as can be seen in the image below. It is not observed on the maxillary first, maxillary second and mandibular second premolars. The word triangular ridges describes linear elevation of triangular shape with point of triangle towards the cuspal tip and base of the triangle towards the central developmental groove. Each well-developed cusp tends to have a triangular ridge extending from the cuspal tip to the central developmental groove. As the maxillary first premolars have two cusps, the buccal cusp and the lingual cusp, therefore there will be two triangular ridges. The triangular ridge on the buccal cusp will be referred as the buccal triangular ridge, whereas the triangular ridge on the lingual cusp will be referred as the lingual triangular ridge. Similarly, the maxillary second premolars also have two triangular ridges, one buccal triangular ridge and the other lingual triangular ridge. Same feature is observed for the mandibular first premolars as well, as they have two cusps, therefore one triangular ridge on buccal cusp is referred to as buccal triangular ridge and triangular ridge on lingual cusp is referred to as lingual triangular ridge. But in the case of three-cusp mandibular second premolar, the number of triangular ridges is different. The three-cusp mandibular molars have one buccal and two lingual cusps. Therefore they have one buccal triangular ridge and two lingual triangular ridges. The lingual triangular ridges are named according to the cusp. The cusp placed mesially on the lingual side is referred as Mesio-Lingual cusp has a triangular ridge known as Mesio-Lingual triangular ridge, whereas the second triangular ridge on another lingual cusp near to distal side known as Disto-Lingual cusp has a triangular ridge known as Disto-Lingual triangular ridge, as can be seen in the image below. The transverse ridge is a special ridge formed on the union of two triangular ridges. It can be observed in the maxillary first premolar on union of the buccal triangular ridge and in the lingual triangular ridge. A special ridge is developed known as transverse ridge. There is only one transverse ridge observed in the maxillary first premolars. Similarly, in the maxillary second premolars and union of the buccal triangular ridge and lingual triangular ridge, formation of a transverse ridge can be observed in the image below. This characteristic feature of a transverse ridge can be observed in the mandibular first premolars as well, formed on the union of buccal triangular ridge and lingual triangular ridge. All maxillary first, maxillary second and the mandibular first premolars tends to have a single transverse ridge as can be observed in the images below. There is no transverse ridges observed for the three cusped mandibular second premolars, as the base of the triangular ridges do not meet to each other in a regular form. Linear elevations marking the borders of each and individual tooth on the mesial and distal sides are referred to as marginal ridges. On the maxillary first premolars, the borders observed on the mesial side is known as mesial marginal ridge, whereas the ridge present on the distal side is referred as distal marginal ridge. Similarly, the mesial marginal ridge and the distal marginal ridge can be observed for the maxillary second premolars. The mesial marginal ridges and the distal marginal ridges can be observed on the mandibular premolars as well as marked in the images below. The word triangular fossa refers to a shallow triangular-shaped concavity usually observed adjacent to the marginal ridges on the mesial and distal sides of the posterior teeth. These triangular fossae can be observed on all premolars of the maxillary and the mandibular arches. The triangular fossa towards the mesial side of the will be referred as mesial triangular fossa, whereas the triangular fossa towards distal side will be marked as the distal triangular fossa. Both mesial and distal triangular fossae can be observed on the maxillary first premolars, as can be observed in the images below. Similarly, mesial triangular fossa and distal triangular fossa can be observed for the maxillary second premolars. On viewing the triangular fossae for the mandibular premolars, it is observed that the mandibular first premolar also has one mesial triangular fossa and other distal triangular fossa. Likewise, mesial and distal triangular fossae are observed for the mandibular second premolars as well. So we can observe two triangular fossae for each and individual premolars of the maxillary and the mandibular arches as marked in the images below. Let us observe the cuspal sharpness for the maxillary and mandibular premolars. In the maxillary first premolars, the lingual cusp is observed to be sharper in comparison to the buccal cusp. Similarly, for the maxillary second premolars as well, the lingual cuspal tips are sharper than the buccal cusp tips. But on observing the mandibular premolars, it is observed the sharpness of buccal and lingual cuspal tips for both mandibular first and the mandibular second premolars is nearly same. Finally, let us evaluate the cuspal width for all maxillary and mandibular premolars. On the maxillary first premolars, the buccal cusp is the largest cusp, followed by the lingual cusp. Similarly, on viewing the width of the maxillary second premolars cusps, they tend to show a similar kind of characteristic feature of having a larger buccal cusp followed by the lingual cusp. It is also observed that the mandibular first premolars have the largest buccal cusp followed by the lingual cusp. In the three-cusped mandibular second premolars, we still have the largest buccal cusp, but it is followed by the Mesio-Lingual cusp marked by MLC and then the Distal-Lingual cusp marked by DLC. These were the important characteristic features which we observed on the maxillary and mandibular premolars. If you have any queries and suggestions, you can write it down in the comment box or can email me for immediate response. Thank you.